Hey, good morning, Choice Residential. Hope your day's off to a wonderful start. Today, I want to talk about unrepresented buyers when they show up on your listings and how to address that in your listing agreement up front so that you're not struggling or stumbling through how to handle that when that situation arises. So let's start with the listing agreement. And I'm going to use really outlandish numbers here just for example's sake, but don't get confused by that. But in the listing agreement, you first are going to specify what is your listing fee for representing the seller. So let's say, for example, that the listing fee you charge is 10%. Well, then you're going to identify what, if anything, you and the seller are agreeing to offer buyer's agent as cooperative compensation. So let's say in this example that you're also offering 10% as a buyer agent compensation. Total compensation is going to be 20% in this example. But you could also have an additional provision in your listing agreement that says if you are the only agent involved in the transaction. Now, keep in mind that that doesn't mean you are representing both sides. But if you are the only agent involved in the transaction, meaning the buyer is unrepresented, then the total commission charged is 15%. And the reason you do that is if there's no buyer agent involved, then the 10% that the seller was willing to offer a buyer agent in compensation, that's off the table. That was designated to pay a buyer's agent who doesn't exist when the unrepresented buyer shows up. However, we know as agents that if an unrepresented buyer is going to be purchasing our listing, there is a lot more work involved because even though we don't represent that buyer, we are basically helping that buyer through every part of the transaction. So we know there is much more time, much more work, and hey, more liability as well. So you may, in that situation, want to receive more than the 10% listing fee that you told the seller you charged, because now there's this additional work that goes along with an unrepresented buyer. So in the additional provisions, you would say, if listing agent is the only agent involved in the transaction, then the total fee paid to the listing firm will be 15%, or whatever real numbers you're using with your agreements. Again, I'm using a fictitious example of 10% listing fee, 10% cooperative compensation to a buyer agent, total of 20% if a buyer agent's involved, and then we're saying 15% if it's an unrepresented buyer. So that way you're addressing the situation up front in case an unrepresented buyer does show up. All right, let's fast forward and talk about when that unrepresented buyer does show up. How do you handle that as the listing agent? So unrepresented buyer shows up to an open house. You get a call or email from them later and they say, hey, I love the house. I want to make an offer. Great. Just to confirm, you don't have an agent you're working with. No, I don't. Okay, great. Well, hopefully you've already reviewed the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, but you want to make sure you go over that with them before they start sharing information with you about what they want to offer. That Working with Real Estate Agents brochure is going to have the box checked that says you represent the seller only. The buyer is going to sign that. That's the only paperwork that you need with that buyer, is them acknowledging that you represent the seller in the seller's best interests and that they are operating as an unrepresented buyer. Then that buyer can tell you what they want to offer. You can help the buyer and seller negotiate those terms out, and then you can reduce all of those terms down to writing in the standard offer to purchase. Now, then you need to send that over to the buyer and say, hey, you need to review all these terms, make sure this is what you're in agreement with, this is what you're offering. You want to make sure you do a good job as the agent of not slipping anything in there or putting information that was not agreed to by the buyer. You don't want to have any conflict with that later. So make sure you're getting detailed and accurate information from that buyer that you can then input into the standard offer to purchase. Once everybody's in agreement, you can help everybody sign and execute that document. If the buyer chooses to have a home inspection, if they ask you for recommendations, you want to avoid that. It's the buyer's decision. You might provide them a few names that they can help them get their search started, but it's incumbent upon them to select the vendors that they would like to use as they navigate the process. But again, you can help them coordinate with a closing attorney, help them get that scheduled, that sort of thing. So you are going to help facilitate the transaction for the benefit of your seller client. Even though you don't represent that buyer. So keep that in mind. You're allowed to communicate with them. You're allowed to help them get things set up. You're helping to usher the transaction to closing because that's in the best interest of your seller. So when you get into these situations, once you've done it once or twice, you start to get the feel for it. But if you're uncomfortable with it, please always reach out to one of the managing brokers here so that we can help guide you in that process. And just remember, the buyer that shows up who's unrepresented, you do not need to enter into agency with them. In fact, in most cases, you should not, because that takes away your representation from the seller. So it's perfectly fine and acceptable and a best practice to allow them to be unrepresented as long as you've disclosed agency properly. So if you ever have questions, please reach out. We want to make sure you navigate these things correctly and for the best interest of your client. So otherwise, if you don't have any other questions, or if you do have comments, put them in the comment section below, and reach out when you have questions. Otherwise, until next time, take care.